Thank you very much for having me. This talk is about instance optimality and the noisy value and comparison model. And what this means is something I'm going to explain in a second. It's a joint work with Vincent Cohn-Haddad and Claire Mathieu. Okay, so let's say you have 589 submissions and you are the PC chair, and your goal is to select the best 150 papers. You don't have space for more, you want exactly 150 papers. And what you can do is you can ask people to review a paper. So you essentially ask reviewers to look at papers and tell you what they think about it. But we all know that reviewing a paper, at least if you do it properly, takes a lot of time, and it's really draining on the people. So you don't want to overdo it. It's a limited resource in some sense. And what we also know is that reviewers make mistakes. That's exactly why this paper got accepted. We assume in this paper, and I'm going to go into the model in more detail in a second, that reviews are going to be incorrect with probability 1/3. Okay, so there's some error in the reviews. All right, and as I said, we're going to look at two different models. One of them is kind of the standard model, what we're using these days, where you just ask a reviewer to look at a paper and give a score from 1 to 6, 1 to 7, or whatever, some integer number. And then there's another model, which is called the comparison model, in which we just give a reviewer two papers, A and B, and ask, which one do you think is better? Okay. And so what we're going to look at is, how can you find the best 150 papers in this context?
A quick question about the model. So what do you mean precisely when you say that a reviewer is wrong with probability 1/3?
So I'm going to go into the details in a second. This is just to mentally prepare you for what's coming up. Okay, so it's not, having this for conferences is only one application, but I think it's a very important one. And I'm going to try to make the point in this talk that the way we do reviews is really crappy, given that we actually we go to theory conferences, etc., and what we do is basically a heuristic. But anyway, let's get to that in a second. You can also do these kind of things for Rotten Tomatoes when you score movies, for example. And the interesting thing here is that people do this by themselves. It's not like when you do reviews that you have to beg people to review a paper. Here, they actually come to you and give you ratings for movies, interestingly enough. Okay, and it also appears in other contexts. For example, in the UK, we have this funny thing that every 7 years, each university has to submit a lot of papers. And then according to the quality of the papers, the university gets money, and a lot of money. So this is really important. And finding the best papers you can submit is a huge task. And it's one of the other applications of kind of this theory. Okay, so now let's get into the model. We're going to always have n papers, and each paper has a hidden value, a ground truth value, some intrinsic value, and this just is the paper's true value. And I always try to draw this in gray above the paper, so you can see that the first paper has a value of 4, the second one is 1, the next one 2, etc. But obviously, when you're the PC chair, you don't know these values. It's not like the authors tell you, "Oh, my paper is only a 1. Don't accept this." You just get the paper. You somehow have to figure out what the value is. We just assume this exists, and this is kind of some ground truth value. All right. And now let's start with the noisy value model. So the noisy value model is the following. You go to a reviewer, you can ask Yara, what's the value of paper A? And most of the time, Yara gives you a proper review back, let's say 2/3 of the time. And 1/3 of the time, he just rotates his dice, or he just picks an adversarial value because he really hates the author also. And here's an example. So let's say the real value of the paper is 4. F is 3. And so an example query would be, or an example output would be just 4. So this is a case where something went wrong, where the adversary was able to choose the value. But if you ask a lot of times, most of the time you see the correct value. So in the limit, you for sure, for every paper, you're going to find out what the right value is. And so because this wasn't very clear, let me do this again. So essentially every query is correct with probability 2/3, independently of the other queries. And with 1/3, it can be an arbitrary value. Is that clear so far?
It's clear, but why does this make sense? Because if I'm reviewing a paper and the PC chair asks me to review the same paper again, I'll be very careful to give exactly the same review back.
That's a good strategy. So the idea is here you ask different reviewers. And we just assume you have a huge pool of reviewers, so you don't ask the same reviewer twice. And in addition to that, when you look at different papers, etc., we don't assume that there's some correlation between reviews just because, you know, Yara reviewed paper A, but he also reviewed paper B, and here's some biases or whatever. So we just completely ignore that. For every paper, it's a fresh randomness of fresh probability of 2/3 to give the correct review. Okay, and now let's get to the noisy comparison model. So here we have two papers, A and B, and one of them has value 3 and the other one is 4. And again, you can ask all sorts of binary comparisons. So you can ask, is A bigger than B? Is A strictly bigger than B? Are they the same? And the adversary is going to give you something incorrect with probability 1/3, and with probability 2/3, you're actually going to get the right answer to this question. So for example, is A bigger than B? Here you were lucky, and the outcome was indeed false. So that's the correct value, right? Because 3 is smaller than 4, so A is actually smaller than B. Okay, and let's say you have a bunch of queries, and you know, most of the time, at least probabilistically speaking, it's going to be correct, but sometimes it's going to be incorrect. But obviously, if you have a lot of papers, then and you only have a few queries, then you can get a completely wrong impression, right? If you have 100 papers or so, and you only ask 2 reviewers per paper, then often you'll just find completely incorrect answers. Just because with probably 1/3 the review was incorrect. Okay, is the noisy comparison model sort of clear? Okay, so here just a comparison again. So the noisy value model is the standard model we look at. It's just this, you send a paper to a reviewer and the reviewer gives you a rating, just a value, an integer, let's say, from 1 to 4. And the noisy comparison, you give 2 papers and you ask which one is better. Okay. And let me just reiterate this. We always assume that each query is independent of the other queries. And it's independently correct with probability 2/3. All right. And so what can you do in this model? So first, what you could do is you could try to find the max paper. And in the context of conferences, this would correspond to finding the best paper. Though we all know this is not really how best papers are selected, but that's a topic for another time. And then there's also the top K problem, which is exactly the problem I started out with. So where you have a conference with a lot of submissions and you try to find the best 150 papers, let's say. In this particular setting, so here's an example for top 4. So you just try to find the best top 4 papers. And if you look at the values, you can see that 3 papers have a value of 4, and then there are a bunch of papers with 3, and then some 2s and 1s. And since you have to find the best 4, you have to find all papers with a value of 4. There are only 3 of them, so you have to find all of them. But then to fill up, to get your 4th paper for your conference proceeding, you have some slack. You can pick any of the papers with a value of 3.
Okay. Does it matter if you suppose have 5 papers with value 4? Does it matter which of those 4 you choose?
No, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you would like.
Thanks.
Welcome. Okay, and then there's a third one, which is quite interesting. It's threshold V. So here you just try to find all papers above a certain threshold. So, you know, think of just conference proceedings without a limitation on how many papers you can accept. So you just want to accept every paper that's really good. So in this case, we want to look for threshold 3. So all papers with a value of at least 3. So in the output, you have to output everything with 3, everything with 4, and nothing with 2 or 1. Okay, so these are the problems we're going to look at. And here are your design goals. So obviously you want to minimize the number of queries because that's how many people you are going to bother with your review requests. And then something maybe not so intuitive is that you also try to minimize the number of rounds. Okay, so what's a round? If you think of regular conferences like SODA or so, what happens is you send your reviews to the reviewers and then you get them back. And that's kind of one round. So they all do this in parallel. And it turns out that this is doing things in parallel is not the best way. If you do it sequentially, then you can get much, much better results. And the intuition here is that you sometimes know already that some papers are so bad, you don't even have to look any further whether they're good. So you can use your query or your review budget in a wise way. You can just say, okay, these papers here on the fence, we don't really know if they're really good or bad, so we need some more reviews for these ones. And that's where you want to invest them. And if you do everything in parallel, then you can't really do that to that extent. So it's much better to have more rounds. But obviously, the more rounds you introduce, the worse it's going to be for the conference, because you have to do this well ahead. So for example, if you want to schedule a SODA and you do reviews sequentially, then it's going to take you probably 5 years of reviews until you found the best, until you find the top K papers. So you have to somehow strike a trade-off here. Okay, and then one other thing that's very important is the success probability of your algorithm. Okay, so back to our two models. Which model would you say is stronger than the other model? Any ideas?
Noisy comparison?
Not quite. But I haven't also told you what I mean by stronger. So what I mean is that you can actually simulate one of them. So you can simulate the noisy comparison model in the noisy value model. And here's what I mean by this. So let's say you have a query up here. Can you see my mouse, by the way? Okay. Let's say the query is A better than B. So this is a query in the comparison model. And here's how you can make this a query in the value model. So what you do is you take paper A and you ask for 5 reviews. Then you take paper B and ask for 5 reviews. And you can do all of this in parallel. And then you just look at the most frequent response. So for the first paper, there were a lot of people who said it's 5. So you're going to just think internally, this is 5. For paper B, you're just going to think it's 2. And then you check if 5 is bigger than 2. And most of the time, this seems to be the case. And so you say, oh yeah, A is bigger than B, right? So this is a way of simulating it. It's not, it doesn't really answer exactly the question which one is stronger, because you have a blow up in the query complexity, but it's only constant. And for this talk, we don't really care about the constants, though actually in the context of reviewing papers, constants matter. But yeah, just for simplicity, we're just going to ignore these constants. And so here's the general statement. It looks complicated, but it's actually really, really simple. So whatever problem you have in the noisy comparison model that you can solve with some given number of queries and some given number of rounds and a given probability, you can solve the same problem in the noisy value model with the same number of rounds, the same probability, and almost the same query complexity. You only blow it up by some constant factor. Okay, and since we have this reduction and we don't care about the constants in our bounds, it's enough for us to show all upper bounds in the noisy comparison model, because then because of the reduction, they also reduce into upper bounds in the noisy value model. And likewise, lower bounds we always show in the value model.
Frederick?
Yeah?
A quick question, just as a sanity check. With the comparison model, you cannot solve the threshold problem, can you?
Ah, very good, very good, very good. So this is exactly my next point. Yeah, you can't solve the threshold problem. So you can't show the other direction. So you can't simulate the noisy value model in the comparison model. That's exactly what Yuval said, because you just don't know the values. You can get the total ordering of the papers. You can say, okay, this paper is better than this one, this one, this one, this one, etc. So you know the exact order, but you still don't know which one is better than, let's say, value 3 or value 4. So this is why the reduction doesn't work in the other direction, at least if you want a reduction for all problems. Okay.
Maybe just one question.
Yeah.
The query model, that means you have exact queries, right?
What do you mean by exact queries?
You say you show lower bounds in the query model. What do you mean by query model then?
Okay. Right. Okay. So this is the typo. Very good. So all the lower bounds are the noisy value model.
Thanks.
Yeah, most of the time. So actually, in one case, we have to show the upper and lower bounds in the different model, just because there's actually a separation between these two models. So it turns out there are some problems that are strictly easier in the value model. Okay, and if I have time, I'll get to that later. Which brings me to the point that I don't exactly know how much time I have.
I think that, or I thought I mentioned that we have this 45-minute slot, and basically you can use it as you wish, but of course it's nice if you leave a bit of time in the end to ask questions.
Okay. Sounds good. So how can we, let's look at the, since we just want to find for now upper bounds in the comparison model, how can we find, for example, the max? So here's a really naive algorithm, and it's really stupid and really wasteful, but as you'll see later, we're going to use it anyway for some certain parts in fancy algorithms. Okay, so here's what you do. You just look at all pairs of papers and compare them 6 log n times. And 6 log n times is enough for you to find out which one is better with high probability. And since there are only n squared pairs in total, just take union over all of them, and voila, you actually know what your top paper is. And not only that, you know much more. You know the complete ordering of all of the papers. But you wasted a lot of queries because it's n squared log n queries. Okay, but the cool thing about this is it's really fast because it only takes you 1 round of reviews. Any questions? Okay. Okay, so here is a fancier algorithm by Feige et al. That uses tournaments to find the max. And this is just like in football, you have these finals at the end of the World Championship, right? So you have some, in the quarterfinals, some teams, they fight against each other, and whoever makes it will then face off an enemy in the semifinals. And then you go to the finals. So, you have this kind of tree structure and you fight each other until there's only one remaining. When you implement this, you have to be actually a bit careful, because what happens is that, let's say, so this is the best paper with 4 here, right? And let's say you have a lot of, papers, much more than 8. Let's say you have 100 papers or 200 papers or so. If you do this and you only have, let's say, 1 comparison per paper, then you're very likely to fail. Because what happens is in every stage, in every level of this tree, you have a constant probability of kicking out the best paper. And so what you actually need to do is you have to increase the number of queries as you go up in the tree. And so, you have 5 queries, let's say, down here, then you have a few more in the next round, etc. And you can show that this is enough then to get your paper through with a good probability. And this is actually quite interesting, because if you think about it, in many games we play, we don't really have that. So someone told me once that there was, I forget which one it was. It might have been cricket, but don't hate me if that's wrong. But there are some games where they actually do this. The higher they go up, the closer they are to the finals, the more comparisons they have. And just one other note, when you increase the number of comparisons, you have to be a bit careful. You don't want to exactly double it, but what you want to do is you want to increase it by some constant that is strictly larger than 1 and strictly smaller than 2. And then everything will work out and you have a small number of queries, because then you have some geometric series going on, etc. And so what happens in this thing is then that you only need log n rounds. But what's more important is that you only need a linear number of queries, O of n queries, to get a success probability of 3/4. All right. Okay.
Do you know from which year this result is? Just this paper that you cited here?
Stone Age. It's 20 years older, I would say, 15. Something in that ballpark.
Okay, thanks.
And okay. And so what we are doing is, this is still not, we're not happy with this. So obviously the query complexity is up to constant optimal, but we can reduce the number of rounds. And that's what we are going to do. So we are going to reduce the number of rounds from log n to log star n. Okay. Our algorithm has 3 parts. In the first part, we're just going to find a pivot element that has a really small rank. The rank is n to the 1/3. So that means that there are only n to the 1/3 papers that are better than this pivot element. And I'm going to tell you later how you can find it. And so once you have this pivot element, what you can do is you can just take all of your papers and compare it to the pivot element. You have to be a bit smart how you do it, but eventually you're going to be able to reduce the number of candidates, the number of papers you think are better than the pivot element, to some number that's in the same ballpark. Let's say 2 times n to the 1/3. Okay. And the cool thing is, once you're left with such a small number of candidates n to the 1/3, all you need to do is to compare them pairwise against each other. So here we use the stupid trivial algorithm that just all pairwise comparisons. And we can do this because, you know, n to the 1/3 is actually a small number. So if you do all pairwise comparisons, you only have n to the 2/3 log n queries. So that's sublinear in n. And so not a problem. Okay. So this is the battle plan. And now I'm going to go into a bit more detail, but if you don't want to listen to this detail, it's fine. It's not important for the rest of the talk, but just if you care about how you can actually do it. So first I'm going to talk about how we find this pivot element. Are there any questions? Okay.
Not so far.
Okay, there will be, depending on how well I explain. Okay, so let's find this pivot element. Right, so what we're going to do is first, we're going to select a random set Y of size n to the 2/3. And what we're going to do now is we're going to just find another pivot prime, but this time, instead of a rank n to the 1/3, it has a rank of n to the 2/3. Okay, and I will tell you later how you can find that pivot. So you can think of this entire thing just as a reduction. If you want to find n to the 1/3, then you can solve this if you can find n to the 2/3. But let's just say somehow through magic, you can find this pivot p prime. Well, then you're done, because what you can do is you can compare all elements in Y log n times to this pivot element. And you can do this because the number of elements in Y is actually quite small. There are not too many. And what you can do then is you can just look at the elements that were larger than this pivot element. And there shouldn't be too many. There can only be n to the 1/3, just because of the size of the sample. And yeah, there's nothing interesting happening here. It's just if you do the math, which I don't really want to do here, it's not complicated though, then you'll see that there are not too many elements that are larger than p prime. And since there's so few elements, we do the same thing we wanted to do earlier. We just do all pairwise comparisons of these candidates, and voila, we get our pivot p. Because what we did is we found the best element of Y, and this best element of Y is going to have a rank that's roughly n to the 1/3. Okay. Any questions? Okay, then I'm going to bother you a bit more with unnecessary levels of detail and tell you about finding an element with rank n to the 2/3. That one is actually quite easy. All you need to do is you find a subset of size n to the 1/3, and you do all pairwise comparisons, etc., to find the maximum of it. And because it has size n to the 1/3, you know, the rank of that element is just going to be n to the 2/3 with respect to the original set. And then you put everything back together, just like these Russian dolls, and and you found your pivot element. Is the high-level idea clear? Or at least the first part of this algorithm? I mean, the main part. It's not so important that we understand all of the details about how to find these pivots. What's going to be important now is the second part. Okay, so we want to find all papers that are, so we assume we have our pivot now, and now we want to find all papers that are appear to be better than this pivot. Okay, and I'm going to make a simplification. Let's say we have a fixed budget per round. Let's say per round we want to invest 5 n queries. Okay, so every round we have the same number of queries, so we have some sort of budget. And since we have initially n candidates, what this means is we can only, on average, we can only compare each element 5 times. And this is exactly what we're going to do, actually. Every element we compare the same number of times. So in this case, 5 times, right? And when you compare it to this pivot, there will be some false negatives and false positives. So sometimes an element is actually smaller, but you will you'll think that it's bigger, just because there's some error in the queries. And let's just say for simplicity, this errors of false positives is 1 over e. So you expect to have n over e false positives. So what this just means is a bunch of papers are still there. They're actually smaller, they're actually worse than your pivot paper, but you haven't seen this yet because there's some error. You still think they might be better. Okay, so, but the cool thing is now in round 2, we actually are left with way fewer papers, right? We started out with n papers and now we have n to the e papers. And since we have this fixed budget of 5n, what this means is we can now compare each paper way more often. Instead of just 5 times, we can compare it 5 times e times, just because we have this fixed budget. So this just comes from this old wisdom that if you have some cake and you share it with a number of people, then everyone gets, let's say, 1 slice. But if you have half as many people, then everyone gets twice as many slices. And that's just the idea here. And if you continue this, you'll actually see something very interesting. So initially, round 1, we had n candidates, 5 comparisons per candidate. And so we had a probability of 1 over e. And now next time, round 2, we have fewer candidates. So we can just do more comparisons per candidate. And since we do more comparisons, our error probability decreases drastically. So from 1 over e, it goes to 1 over e to the e. And since this error probability is so much smaller, you're also left with way smaller elements in the 3rd round. And this just continues like this. And you can see that this error probability here decreases as some tower function. And that's exactly why you need log star n rounds, because this tower function is just the inverse of log star n. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so the thing is I lied a tiny bit to you because the number of queries we have here is not going to be linear. It's going to be log star n, because what we did is we fixed the number of queries per round to be 5n, no matter in which round we are. So, but if you change this slightly and you decrease the number of queries over time just by a tiny bit, you still get some tower function here, but at the same time, you're also able to reduce the number of queries to O of n. So in other words, you get log star n rounds, which is optimal, as we also show in the paper, and you get O of n queries. All right. And so we did the first part, find this pivot, then we eliminated candidates, and then, as I said, now you're left with very few papers, do pairwise comparisons, and you're done. And this last thing only takes you 1 round. So the first one is going to take you a small constant number of rounds. The second part is going to take you log star n rounds, and then plus 1 round. Okay, and so overall we need log star n plus 4 rounds, and we get a success probability that's constant. But we also show how you can improve this to get a better probability. But then your log star n changes slightly.
What is slightly?
Okay, I think we see it in a second. I'm going to show you how it's going to change in a second. Okay. So, or maybe let's do it now. So what's going to happen is that you have some log with the error probability in here. So it's not n queries. You have n log 1 over delta queries. You know, if you want a success probability of 1 minus delta, and this log n star is going to be with a different basis. So usually, log star n has a basis of e, so it's a bunch of e stacks, right? So it's the inverse function to e to the e to the e. And here it's going to be the inverse function to 1 over delta. So it's 1 over delta over 1 over delta, 1 over delta. It's a bit weird to think about, but it grows even quicker. So it reduces log n star to something that's even smaller. Okay. Right. So, but we don't really care about finding the max. What we want for conference proceedings is to find the best K papers. And if I lost you in the part before, that's completely fine, because now, we just treat this maximum as a black box. And this algorithm is much easier. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our papers. Just think of, you print all of your papers for the conference and you put them in different stacks. And you have k to the 4 different parts or stacks for their papers. And you just put them on each of these stacks. And then what you try to do is you try to find the max in each of these stacks, in each of these parts, each of these stacks. You just find the best paper in each of these stacks. And once you did this for all of these stacks, what you can do is now, since you don't have too many of these stacks, let's say we only have k to the 4, you can just do all pairwise comparisons, and then you find the best papers. Okay, but what's important here is that you are reasonably sure in every stack. So you have to be able to find the best paper with a good probability, and your error probability has to be, let's say, 1 over k to the 7 or so. And so in every stack you find your best paper. You don't have too many papers then in the end, and you can just compare all of them and just output the best k. And that will give you n log k queries and log star n with base k rounds. And we also show in the paper this is optimal. You can't do less than that. So you definitely, no matter how many rounds you're going to use, you're going to need n log k queries. And if you fix this query complexity, then this is exactly how many rounds you need. You can't do it with fewer rounds. Up to this additive constant here. It might be -1 or so, but it's, yeah, that's how long it takes. All right, any questions?
Do you have like intuition of why this log star thing is necessary? Like, is it intuitive where it comes from?
Yeah, so it just comes from the same reason as we had, as the upper bound has, because what happens, put this here, essentially you always going to have these false positives, and you can show that in every, really show that some sort of number of rounds, and in every round you're gonna have it. And so there will be a lot of papers that look exactly the same to you. Design an adversary that just tells you wrong values of papers. All of these papers 100% exact to you. And you can show that if you only invested, let's say, X many queries, then you'll have Y many papers that look all the same to you. And using this argument, you can then show that it just takes log and star rounds.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay. But, you know, so what this also means is if it takes n log k, then that's actually a lot if you think about conference proceedings, because, you know, paying the k and k for SODA that is really costly. So you can ask, okay, maybe we don't want to find the best K papers. Maybe we can allow some slack. And one way of doing it is trying to find papers that are reasonably good. So let's say you want to find, so this is what we call approximate top K. So instead of finding the best 3 papers, let's just say we want to find 3 papers among the best 5. Okay? So you want to find 3 papers among the best 5. So every paper you output is still reasonably good. None of your papers in your conference proceedings are going to be really, really crap. Okay? But you might have missed some really good papers. Okay, and if you do this, then, and you set these values in a reasonable way, then you can reduce the number of queries from n log k to a linear number of queries. Okay, and how do you do this? It's pretty much the same algorithm. We still have our idea of having different stacks. And it's just that this time, instead of insisting that we find the best paper with a really, really good probability per stack, we're just going to say, okay, let's find the best paper with a probability of 1/12, some constant probability. So it's kind of the YOLO approach. What's going to happen is, for many of these stacks, we're going to find the correct paper, but for some, we'll make a mistake. And this is just bound to happen. But it's okay because, we have some slack in there. We are only looking for an approximation. So that's okay here. We're just going to find k to the 4 papers for each of these buckets. And for most of them, it's going to be the correct paper of the stack. And so when we look for the top K papers among these remaining papers, we still have preserved most of the, let's say, top 5 papers. So we're still going to get a good conference proceeding. Does this make sense? So it's really the same algorithm as before, but the only difference is that you're not asking for the same success probability in each stack. You are happy with a much worse success probability. Okay. And by the way, the reason why you have so many different stacks, k to the 4, it's just that it's very, very unlikely for 2 papers among the top k to be in the same stack. This just follows from a boards into bins argument. So you have kind of k to the 4 bins and only k balls. So none of them is going to end up in the same bin with a very good high probability in k. Okay, and so voila, you got a linear number of queries, log star n rounds, which is again optimal, and a constant success probability. All right, let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, I think I have to come to an end. You can also get bounds for the threshold problem. There, our bounds are not 100% tied. We have some log k factor that is in there. Yeah, it probably shouldn't be there, but that's just how it is for us. As I said, the round complexity we for max and for top k is optimal, and the same for the query complexity. All right, and just let me say one word to see, and this is about, so what I want to say is that the value model and the comparison model, most of the time they're the same, but there's this one problem we found where they're different. So if it's called rank K problem, and what happens here is that each paper, you promise that each paper has a different intrinsic value. So there are no 2 papers with the same value. And if you promise this, then there's a difference. As long as k is much smaller than n. What you can show is in the comparison model, it's going to take you n log k queries. But if k is much smaller than n, then you can do it in the value model actually with O of n queries. And the algorithm is actually quite simple. What you do is, it's really slow, but it does work. Whenever there are 2, so you always look at, for each paper, at the value that was returned most often. And that's your guess for that paper. And whenever there are 2 papers with the same guess, well, one of them is wrong because there can only be one. So you just repeat until you break this equality, until you find out that one of them is actually a different one. And then you continue and you break all of these egalities, and until you're left with n different guesses or values, and then you're happy. All right. But yeah, this is just to say that these models are actually different. Okay. And in the paper, we also talk about instance optimality. So instance optimality is this concept of what happens if you know something about the instance, if you know that, okay, this is the percentage of quality 4 papers, this is the percentage of quality 3 papers, etc. Does that help you? And the answer is it doesn't really help you. Spoiler alert. Okay. And so obviously this is, this model I introduced is different from what's actually happening in the real world. It's not exactly a good model for conferences. There are many things that are wrong because the PC also discusses papers afterwards, which could be seen as a round, and this error probability of 2/3 is a bit arguable, and some other things. But that's still the message here that we need to think about how we design our conference, especially since we're doing algorithms. We should have something better than a heuristic to find our best papers. We should come up with some reasonable model and a proof to show that, okay, this is actually a good thing what we're doing, because right now it's not even clear to me what we are exactly finding in our fixed number of reviews. And and in particular in this model, what we saw is that if you want to find the best paper, even the best paper is going to take you log star n rounds, and not just some fixed constant that is always 3, no matter how many submissions you have. So think of NeurIPS or so, where they have 8,000 submissions or so, and only 1 round. It's not going to work. And the same is if you want to find the best K papers, then you're going to need n-log K queries. Okay, and that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks for the nice talk, and we have now a few minutes to ask questions. So go ahead, and again, feel free to talk or raise your hand, and then I try to give you the chance to ask questions. And Petteri has his hand up, so go ahead.
All right, hi, thanks for a very nice talk first. So I'm wondering, of course, in reality, in conferences, indeed, you have, let's say, 1,000 submissions, and then you want to top 100. So if you start fixing concrete values for your N and K, so then basically, can you get the exact constants even, or somehow? Because then it, of course, becomes a finite problem to design, let's say, an evaluation network or whatnot. How fine-grained are your techniques?